In the year 1347, Europe was a world of kings, merchants, and ordinary families, unaware that something terrible was already moving toward them. Across the ancient trade routes, ships carried silk, spices, grain, and something far more dangerous. Then, in Sicily, the first ships arrived, and with them came a disease no one understood. A terrible sickness spread from village to village, bringing fear and uncertainty to everyone. Physicians had medicines and prayers, but they had no cure for the terrible disease. The plague did not care whether you were rich or poor, powerful or unknown. Some believed the plague was divine punishment, while others searched for answers in medicine, religion, and the stars. The plague changed more than human lives. It changed work, wealth, power, and medieval society itself. Europe survived, but it would never return to the world that existed before the plague. The Black Death killed millions, but its greatest legacy was the world it left behind. This is the story of the plague that changed the world.
Let's get started the full history. The Black Death, the plague that changed the world. In the middle of the 14th century, Europe was a world of crowded cities, powerful kings, enormous churches, struggling peasants, ambitious merchants, and ordinary people who had little idea that their lives were about to be transformed forever. For centuries, European society had grown around familiar rhythms. Farmers planted and harvested their crops. Merchants traveled between cities. Ships crossed the Mediterranean carrying spices, silk, grain, and precious metals. Children were born, baptized, and raised within communities that had existed for generations. Churches marked the passing of the seasons, while kings and nobles fought wars over territory and power. Then, almost without warning, something arrived that could not be defeated by swords, castles, prayers, or wealth. It was a disease. And within only a few years, it would kill tens of millions of people. The catastrophe became known as the Black Death. Between roughly 1347 and 1352, the plague swept across Europe, killing an enormous portion of the population. Modern historians generally estimate that somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's population died, although the exact number remains impossible to determine. The wider pandemic also devastated communities across parts of North Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. But the Black Death was more than a terrible epidemic. It was a social revolution. It disrupted economies. It weakened old institutions. It transformed labor. It changed religious attitudes. It altered warfare, government, family life, art, literature, and medicine. And perhaps most importantly, it changed the relationship between ordinary people and the societies in which they lived. To understand the Black Death, however, we have to begin before the plague arrived. We have to understand the world it entered. #Europe before the Black Death. Around the year 1300, Europe was experiencing significant growth. The population had expanded dramatically during the preceding centuries. New farmland had been brought under cultivation, forests had been cleared, villages had grown, and cities had become increasingly important centers of commerce. The medieval world was not a static place. Trade routes connected distant regions. Italian merchants traveled throughout the Mediterranean. German merchants operated networks across northern Europe. English wool was shipped abroad and exchanged for foreign goods. French towns grew around markets, workshops, and fairs. Some cities were becoming remarkably wealthy. Florence, Venice, Genoa, Paris, Bruges, London, and many other urban centers were filled with merchants, craftsmen, laborers, religious institutions, and travelers. Yet this prosperity had a fragile foundation. Europe's population had grown faster than its agricultural resources could comfortably support. By the early 14th century, much of the best farmland was already being used. Farmers were increasingly cultivating marginal lands that produced smaller harvests. Then came a series of disasters. The early 14th century brought repeated crop failures, severe weather, and famine. One of the worst periods came during the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317. Heavy rains damaged harvests across large parts of northern Europe. Grain became scarce. Food prices rose. Livestock died. Malnutrition spread. For ordinary people, hunger was not simply uncomfortable. It was dangerous. A person who was already weakened by poor nutrition was more vulnerable to disease. Europe therefore entered the 14th century with a large population, economic tensions, political conflicts, and communities whose health could deteriorate quickly when disaster struck. Nobody knew what was coming. #A world connected by trade. The plague did not appear in Europe in isolation. It traveled along the same networks that carried goods, people, and ideas. The medieval world was more interconnected than we sometimes imagine. From China and Central Asia to the Middle East and the Mediterranean, merchants traveled enormous distances. Caravans crossed deserts and mountain passes. Ships moved through ports along the Black Sea and Mediterranean. Among the commodities traveling these routes were grains, textiles, spices, metals, and countless other goods. And sometimes, without anyone realizing it, animals traveled too. Rats and other small mammals could live around human settlements and ships. Fleas could move between animals and humans. The bacterium responsible for plague, Yersinia pestis, could circulate within animal populations and, under certain conditions, spill over into human communities. Modern science has given us a much clearer understanding of this process than medieval people possessed. They did not know about bacteria. They did not know about microscopic pathogens. They did not understand the role of fleas or animal reservoirs. When the plague arrived, therefore, medieval people had almost no scientific framework for explaining what was happening. They only knew that people were becoming sick. And then they were dying. The origins of the plague. The precise origins of the Black Death remain an important subject of historical and scientific research. For centuries, historians debated where the pandemic began. Modern genetic and archaeological research has strongly connected the 14th century pandemic to plague reservoirs in Central Asia, with important evidence pointing toward the broader region around the Tian Shan Mountains in present-day Kyrgyzstan. The disease was caused by Yersinia pestis, a bacterium that still exists in wildlife populations today. Plague was not a new disease in human history. Earlier outbreaks had occurred. The most famous was the plague of Justinian, which struck the Byzantine Empire and other regions beginning in the 6th century. But the 14th century pandemic would become one of the most destructive disease events ever experienced by humanity. The plague existed in animal populations for long periods without necessarily producing a massive human epidemic. The danger emerged when ecological, environmental, and human conditions allowed the disease to spread widely. And in the 14th century, the world was connected enough for that spread to become catastrophic. #The Siege of Caffa. One of the most famous episodes associated with the arrival of plague in Europe involves the city of Caffa, a Genoese trading colony on the Crimean Peninsula. In the late 1340s, Caffa was under siege by forces of the Mongol Golden Horde. According to a famous account written by the Genoese notary Gabriele de Mussi, plague struck the besieging army. De Mussi described horrifying scenes and claimed that infected bodies were thrown over the walls into the city. The story has become one of the most famous episodes in histories of biological warfare. But historians debate how literally the account should be interpreted. The exact role of the siege in spreading plague to Europe remains uncertain. What is much more certain is that Caffa was an important commercial center connected to Mediterranean trade. From the Black Sea, ships could carry people and goods toward Constantinople and other ports. If infected people, fleas, or contaminated materials traveled aboard those ships, the disease could move with them. And eventually, it did. The plague reaches Constantinople. By the late 1340s, plague had reached major cities around the eastern Mediterranean. Constantinople, the great capital of the Byzantine Empire, was one of the places affected. The city was enormous by medieval standards and connected to trade routes stretching across Europe and Asia. It was also densely populated. That made it an ideal environment for a rapidly spreading disease. From the eastern Mediterranean, plague moved westward. Ships carried it toward Sicily and mainland Italy. And there, the catastrophe became impossible to ignore. Sicily, 1347. In October 1347, ships associated with Genoese trade arrived at the Sicilian port of Messina. What happened next became one of the defining moments in European history. The ships carried sick people. Many were already dead or dying. Local authorities quickly realized something was terribly wrong. The disease spread rapidly. People developed fever, weakness, painful swellings, and other horrifying symptoms. Many died within days. The authorities attempted to control the situation, but medieval governments had limited knowledge of contagion. They did not know what caused the disease. They did not know how it moved. They did not understand the importance of isolation in the modern epidemiological sense. And they certainly did not possess antibiotics. The plague escaped. From Sicily it moved into Italy. From Italy it spread toward France and Spain. It traveled through ports, roads, markets, and communities. The greatest pandemic Europe had seen in centuries had begun. What did the plague do to the human body? The Black Death was not one single clinical experience. Plague could appear in different forms. The most famous was bubonic plague. In bubonic plague, bacteria entered the body and traveled to the lymphatic system. The lymph nodes could become severely swollen. These painful swellings became known as buboes. They could appear in the groin, armpits, or neck. Victims could develop fever, weakness, chills, headaches, and other symptoms. Some patients recovered. Many did not. Another form was septicemic plague, in which the bacteria entered the bloodstream. This could cause severe systemic illness and tissue damage. Pneumonic plague affected the lungs and could spread through respiratory droplets between people under certain conditions. For medieval observers, the symptoms must have seemed almost supernatural. A healthy person could become sick and die in a matter of days. Families watched relatives collapse. Neighbors disappeared. Entire households could vanish. And because the disease was poorly understood, fear often spread faster than reliable information. The plague enters Italy. Italy was particularly vulnerable. The Italian peninsula contained numerous prosperous cities connected by intense commercial networks. Venice, Genoa, Florence, Pisa, and other cities were deeply integrated into Mediterranean trade. The same commercial connections that created wealth also created pathways for disease. By 1348, plague had reached many parts of Italy. Florence suffered enormously. The city was a major center of banking, trade, textile production, and culture. It was also densely populated. The Italian writer Giovanni Boccaccio lived through the epidemic in Florence. His famous work The Decameron begins with a description of the plague. Boccaccio described a society in which the normal structures of life seemed to collapse. People avoided one another. Some abandoned sick relatives. Funeral customs changed. Fear dominated everyday behavior. The dead became so numerous that ordinary burial practices could no longer always be maintained. Boccaccio's account is literary rather than a modern epidemiological report, but it provides one of the most famous windows into the psychological atmosphere of the pandemic. The plague moves north. From Italy, the disease continued spreading. It reached France. It entered southern France through Mediterranean ports. Marseille was badly affected. From there it moved inland. Paris suffered. The disease also entered the Iberian Peninsula. Spain experienced devastating outbreaks. Cities and villages lost enormous numbers of inhabitants. The plague did not care about political borders. It crossed kingdoms. It crossed linguistic boundaries. It crossed religious divisions. It crossed social classes. Kings could die. Merchants could die. Priests could die. Peasants could die. Children could die. The rich could become sick. The poor could become sick. Nobody fully understood why some survived and others did not. #England, 1348. By 1348, the plague was approaching England. It probably reached southern England through coastal trade connections. One important early outbreak occurred in Dorset. From there, the disease moved rapidly through the country. The English population had no natural immunity to this new wave of plague. Villages were devastated. Towns were devastated. Monasteries were affected. The disease eventually reached London. London was a crowded medieval city. Its streets were narrow. Sanitation was poor by modern standards. Waste accumulated in urban environments. Animals lived close to people. The Thames connected the city to an enormous trading network. Under such conditions, a contagious disease could spread with terrifying speed. #London in the time of the Black Death. Imagine walking through London in 1349. The city would look completely different from the London we know today. There were no skyscrapers. No cars. No electric lights. The streets were narrow and often muddy. Buildings were packed together. Markets were busy. Horses, carts, merchants, craftsmen, beggars, priests, and laborers filled the streets. Then the plague arrived. At first, people might have heard rumors. Someone in a neighboring house had become sick. Then another family. Then several. Soon, the rumors were everywhere. People began to understand that something extraordinary was happening. Some fled the city. Others could not afford to leave. Some remained because they had jobs, businesses, or families. Others stayed because they believed that abandoning their community was morally wrong. The sick needed care. But caring for the sick could expose caregivers to disease. Parents could become infected while caring for children. Children could become infected while caring for parents. Priests could become infected while visiting dying parishioners. Doctors and healers could become infected while treating patients. The people most needed during the crisis were often among those placed at greatest risk. Death on an unprecedented scale. The exact death toll of the Black Death remains uncertain. Medieval records were incomplete. Different regions kept different kinds of records. Some places recorded deaths carefully. Others recorded very few. Some entire communities disappeared without leaving reliable population records. Modern historians therefore work with estimates. A common estimate is that perhaps 30 to 50% of Europe's population died during the main wave of the pandemic. The wider mortality across Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa may have reached tens of millions. Some regions suffered especially severe losses. Others experienced lower mortality. The plague was not evenly distributed. But everywhere it appeared, it had the potential to transform communities. The collapse of ordinary life. The Black Death did something that armies rarely accomplish. It interrupted everyday life. Markets closed. Fields went untended. Workshops lost workers. Ships lacked crews. Churches lost priests. Manors lost laborers. Governments struggled to collect taxes. Families lost parents. Children lost parents. Communities lost generations. Imagine a village where 50 families had lived for decades. Then imagine that a third of them disappear. Then half. The surviving population would inherit houses, tools, animals, land, and possessions belonging to people who were suddenly gone. The social structure of the village would never be exactly the same again. The crisis of the Church. The Catholic Church was one of the most powerful institutions in medieval Europe. For ordinary people, religion was not simply something practiced on Sunday. It shaped almost every part of life. Birth, marriage, illness, death, burial, morality, education, and politics were deeply connected to Christianity. During the Black Death, therefore, the Church became central to the crisis. Priests were expected to care for the sick and dying. They administered the sacraments. They heard confessions. They performed burials. But priests were human beings. They could become infected too. Many died. In some regions, such a large proportion of clergy died that churches struggled to replace them. This had long-term consequences. New priests sometimes had less training. Religious institutions lost experienced leaders. Some people became more devoted. Others became disillusioned. Some interpreted the plague as divine punishment. Others questioned why a supposedly merciful God would allow so many innocent people to die. The pandemic therefore intensified religious feelings in many different directions. The search for an explanation. People needed an explanation. Modern people understand that epidemics can have biological causes. Medieval Europeans did not have that knowledge. Medical theory was heavily influenced by ancient Greek and Roman ideas. Many physicians believed disease was connected to an imbalance of bodily fluids known as humors. Others believed harmful environmental conditions or corrupted air could cause illness. Astrology sometimes played a role in explanations. Religious interpretations were also common. Some people believed the plague was God's punishment for human sin. Others believed that supernatural forces were responsible. Still others blamed particular groups. And this last response would have horrifying consequences. Scapegoating and the persecution of Jews. One of the darkest consequences of the Black Death was the persecution of Jewish communities. As people searched for someone to blame, false rumors spread that Jews were responsible for poisoning wells or deliberately spreading the disease. There was no truth to these accusations. Jewish communities were victims of the plague just like Christian communities. Yet fear and hatred created a deadly combination. In parts of Europe, Jewish people were arrested, tortured, expelled, and murdered. Mass killings occurred in numerous places. Some Jewish communities were destroyed. The persecution was driven by a mixture of religious prejudice, economic resentment, political opportunism, and panic. The Black Death did not create anti-Semitism. Anti-Jewish prejudice had existed for centuries. But the crisis gave existing hatred a new and deadly excuse. This is one of the most important lessons of the pandemic. When people are terrified and do not understand the cause of a disaster, they may look for a human enemy. And when societies allow fear to replace evidence, innocent people can pay the price. The flagellants. Another response to the plague was the rise of penitential movements. One of the most famous groups was the flagellants. They believed that public acts of penance could help bring divine mercy. Groups of men traveled from town to town, publicly whipping themselves as an act of religious repentance. Their processions could attract large crowds. To modern observers, the practice may seem extreme. But to people living through mass death, extraordinary behavior could seem reasonable. If the world appeared to be collapsing, perhaps extraordinary repentance was necessary. Church authorities eventually became increasingly hostile toward the flagellant movement. But their popularity reveals the psychological desperation of the period. People were searching for meaning in a world that seemed to have lost its normal order. The doctors of the Middle Ages. Medieval medicine was not completely useless. Physicians possessed knowledge inherited from ancient Greek, Roman, Persian, and Islamic medical traditions. Medical practitioners observed symptoms. They prescribed diets, medicines, and procedures. They understood some basic principles of anatomy and disease. But they lacked the tools necessary to identify bacteria. There were no microscopes. There was no germ theory. There were no antibiotics. There was no modern epidemiology. A physician could observe that one person became sick after another, but could not necessarily understand why. Treatments therefore varied enormously. Some involved herbal medicines. Others involved bloodletting. Some doctors recommended changes in diet. Others prescribed elaborate mixtures. Certain treatments may have provided comfort. Others probably did nothing. Some could make patients worse. But physicians themselves were working within the best framework available to them. They were not ignorant in the simple sense. They were limited by the knowledge of their time. Why did the plague spread so quickly? Several factors contributed. First, medieval trade networks connected distant populations. Second, cities were densely populated. Third, sanitation systems were primitive compared with modern standards. Fourth, people and animals lived in close proximity. Fifth, medical knowledge about infectious disease was extremely limited. Sixth, the population had already experienced periods of famine and nutritional stress. And perhaps most importantly, the disease entered populations that had little recent exposure to this particular strain of plague. The plague did not need modern transportation to cross continents. A medieval merchant ship was fast enough. A caravan was fast enough. A traveling soldier was fast enough. A rat was fast enough. A flea was fast enough. Human civilization had created networks capable of spreading disease long before it created modern medicine. The Black Death and the peasantry. The poorest people often suffered terribly during the initial outbreak. Peasants lived close to animals and often had limited access to medical care. They could not simply escape to private country estates. If a village was struck, there might be nowhere safe to go. But the demographic collapse eventually changed the economic position of surviving peasants. This was one of the most important consequences of the Black Death. Europe had suddenly lost enormous numbers of workers. Land still existed. Houses still existed. Crops still needed to be harvested. Animals still needed to be cared for. But there were fewer people available to do the work. Labor therefore became more valuable. And that changed the balance of power between workers and landowners. The labor shortage. Before the Black Death, many European peasants lived within systems of feudal obligation. In different regions, the exact arrangements varied enormously. Some peasants owed labor to landlords. Others paid rents. Some were legally tied to particular estates. The post-plague world was different. With fewer workers available, surviving laborers could demand higher wages or better conditions. A farmer who once had no choice but to work for one lord might now have alternatives. A skilled craftsman might be able to demand more money. A servant could leave one employer and find another. This did not happen everywhere in the same way. But across parts of Europe, the bargaining power of labor increased dramatically. Governments fight back. Landowners and governments did not simply accept the new labor market. They attempted to control wages. In England, for example, the government issued the Ordinance of Labourers in 1349 and the Statute of Labourers in 1351. These measures attempted to regulate wages and labor relationships. The basic problem was simple. Before the plague, there had been many workers. After the plague, there were far fewer. Employers wanted labor to remain cheap. Workers wanted higher wages. The government attempted to restrict the new bargaining power of laborers. This created resentment. And eventually, that resentment would contribute to major social unrest. The peasants' revolt. In 1381, decades after the first Black Death outbreak, England experienced the Peasants' Revolt. The rebellion had multiple causes. Taxes were important. So were attempts to enforce labor restrictions and resentment toward the existing social order. The revolt was not simply a direct result of the Black Death. But the demographic and economic changes created by the plague helped transform the relationship between peasants, landlords, and government. Thousands of rebels marched toward London. They demanded reforms. The young King Richard II met the rebels. The revolt eventually collapsed, and its leaders were killed. But the underlying transformation continued. The medieval social order had been shaken. The economic revolution. The Black Death did not simply destroy wealth. It redistributed it. When millions of people died, their property passed to survivors. Land became more abundant relative to labor. Wages could rise. Food prices could fall in some regions because there were fewer consumers. Luxury goods could become more accessible to surviving workers. In some areas, peasants gained access to land that had previously been difficult to obtain. In other areas, landlords successfully maintained control. The effects differed from place to place. But across Europe, the old economic balance was disrupted. The Black Death helped accelerate long-term changes that were already underway. Cities after the plague. Urban life also changed. Some towns recovered relatively quickly. Others declined. Some communities never regained their previous population. Vacant houses appeared. Businesses disappeared. Workshops closed. But surviving cities could eventually become wealthier. Why? Because fewer people meant that resources could be concentrated among survivors. A worker who inherited property from deceased relatives might suddenly possess more wealth. A merchant might acquire abandoned businesses. A landowner might control more property. A craftsman could earn higher wages. The result was an uneven redistribution of wealth. The Black Death created enormous suffering, but it also created conditions that allowed certain survivors to improve their economic position. The psychological impact. The physical death toll was only part of the story. The psychological consequences lasted for generations. People had witnessed death on a scale that was difficult to comprehend. They had watched parents die. They had buried children. They had seen neighbors disappear. They had witnessed entire communities transformed within months. This changed attitudes toward mortality. Art became more focused on death. Literature explored suffering and uncertainty. Religious imagery became more intense. The theme of death became increasingly visible in European culture. One famous artistic tradition that developed later was the Dance of Death, or Danse Macabre. In these images, skeletons appear alongside kings, merchants, peasants, and other members of society. The message was simple. Death comes for everyone. The Black Death did not invent the medieval fascination with death. But it intensified it dramatically. The rise of the macabre. Before the plague, medieval European art already contained images of death. But after the pandemic, representations of skeletons, corpses, graves, and judgment became especially prominent. The idea that wealth and social status could not protect a person from death became more powerful. A king could die. A bishop could die. A merchant could die. A peasant could die. The plague had demonstrated this fact in the most brutal possible way. Death was the ultimate equalizer. Families were transformed. Perhaps the most intimate consequence of the Black Death occurred inside households. Families were destroyed. A child might lose both parents. A husband might lose his wife. A wife might lose her husband. Siblings might disappear. Some survivors remarried quickly. This was not necessarily cold or heartless. Life had become uncertain. Widows and widowers needed economic support. Children needed guardians. Households had to be rebuilt. Marriage patterns therefore changed in some areas. The demographic crisis also affected birth rates. Europe would take generations to recover its population. Orphans and abandoned children. Large numbers of children were left without parents. Some were taken in by relatives. Others were absorbed into new households. Some became servants. Some entered religious institutions. Others may have been left vulnerable to poverty and exploitation. The social consequences of losing a generation of adults could persist for decades. Communities had to rebuild not only their populations but also their knowledge. Skilled workers had died. Teachers had died. Priests had died. Administrators had died. Craft traditions were interrupted. The loss was not simply numerical. It was cultural. The plague returns. The Black Death of 1347 to 1352 was not the end. Plague did not disappear from Europe. It returned repeatedly. Later outbreaks occurred in the following centuries. Some were smaller. Some were severe. The disease became part of the European environment. Communities gradually developed more sophisticated responses. Quarantine became increasingly important. Ports began implementing measures to isolate ships and travelers. The famous 40-day isolation period eventually became associated with the word quarantine, derived from the Italian quaranta, meaning 40. The city of Venice and other Mediterranean ports played important roles in developing systems of public health control. These measures did not eliminate plague. But they represented an important step toward organized disease prevention. Quarantine and public health. Medieval and early modern governments slowly learned that separating potentially infected people could reduce transmission. This was a major conceptual development. Authorities did not need to understand bacteria to recognize that contact with infected people was dangerous. They could observe patterns. If ships from infected areas were isolated, perhaps fewer people became sick. If travelers were restricted, perhaps outbreaks could be delayed. If houses containing infected people were marked or isolated, perhaps disease could be contained. These practices were imperfect. But they helped create the foundations of later public health. The Black Death therefore contributed, indirectly, to the development of institutional approaches to epidemic disease. Did people really believe the earth was flat? One common misconception about the Middle Ages is that medieval Europeans generally believed the earth was flat. That is not accurate. Educated medieval Europeans inherited a long tradition of understanding the earth as spherical. Medieval scholars studied astronomy and geography. The problem was not that people were incapable of rational thought. The problem was that their scientific framework lacked modern microbiology. They could reason carefully and still reach incorrect conclusions because they lacked critical information. This distinction matters. The Black Death demonstrates that human intelligence alone is not enough. Scientific knowledge depends on tools, experiments, accumulated evidence, and methods. Without microscopes, germ theory was almost impossible to develop. Without knowledge of bacteria, plague remained mysterious. The Muslim world and the Black Death. The Black Death was not only a European catastrophe. The Islamic world was also devastated. The disease spread through North Africa and the Middle East. Major cities experienced severe outbreaks. Cairo, Damascus, and other important centers suffered repeated epidemics. Muslim scholars and physicians documented the disease. One of the most important historical figures associated with the pandemic was Ibn Khaldun. He was a North African scholar and historian whose family suffered greatly during the plague. In his famous Muqaddimah, Ibn Khaldun reflected on the enormous mortality caused by the epidemic. His observations reveal that the plague was understood not merely as a local medical problem but as a civilization-level catastrophe. The loss of people affected economies, governments, scholarship, and political power. The Mongol world. The plague also affected territories connected to the Mongol Empire and its successor states. The Mongol conquests had helped create an enormous zone of trade and communication across Eurasia. The same networks that facilitated commerce could also facilitate disease transmission. This is an important historical paradox. Greater connectivity creates opportunities. It can spread wealth, technology, and knowledge. But it can also spread pathogens. The Black Death was one of the earliest examples in history of how interconnected Eurasian societies could experience a common biological crisis. The Byzantine Empire. The Byzantine Empire was already under enormous pressure before the Black Death. Territorial losses, political conflicts, wars, and economic difficulties had weakened the empire. Then plague arrived. The disease further reduced population and economic capacity. Constantinople suffered repeated outbreaks. The empire never fully recovered its earlier strength. The Black Death was not the sole reason for the eventual fall of Constantinople in 1453. But it was one of many pressures that weakened the Byzantine world during its final centuries. The Black Death and War. War continued during the plague. The 100 Years' War between England and France did not simply stop because of the epidemic. Military campaigns were disrupted. Armies lost soldiers. Governments lost tax revenue. But war itself could also help spread disease. Soldiers traveled. Armies moved through towns. Refugees fled. Trade routes changed. The movement of large populations created additional opportunities for infection. The pandemic therefore interacted with political conflicts rather than existing separately from them. The end of an old economic order. One of the greatest historical debates surrounding the Black Death concerns how much it contributed to the decline of feudalism. It would be too simple to say. The plague ended feudalism. Feudal institutions varied across Europe. Some survived for centuries. Others changed gradually. But the demographic collapse undeniably weakened some traditional relationships. When labor became scarce, workers gained bargaining power. When landlords struggled to find labor, they had incentives to offer better terms. When peasants could move more freely, traditional obligations became harder to enforce. In Western Europe, this helped accelerate the long-term decline of serfdom. In Eastern Europe, the story was different. In some regions, landlords eventually strengthened their control over peasants. This divergence would become historically important. England's changing society. England offers an especially interesting example. Before the plague, many English peasants lived under systems of manorial obligation. After the plague, surviving laborers could demand higher wages. Landowners responded with legislation and enforcement. But economic forces were difficult to control permanently. Over the following centuries, more peasants gained access to land or moved into wage labor. The old medieval order gradually weakened. The transformation was slow. The Black Death was not an immediate revolution. It was a massive shock that accelerated existing changes. The rise of the individual. Another long-term cultural consequence may have been a growing emphasis on individual experience. The medieval world was strongly communal. People were members of villages, guilds, churches, families, and estates. But the plague forced individuals to confront mortality personally. Writers increasingly explored personal fear, grief, pleasure, and uncertainty. Boccaccio's Decameron is a famous example. The story follows a group of young people who leave plague-stricken Florence and tell stories to one another. The book is filled with humor, sexuality, morality, deception, intelligence, and human weakness. That mixture is significant. In the face of death, people did not only become religious or miserable. Some also pursued pleasure. They ate. They drank. They told stories. They laughed. They sought companionship. Human beings respond to catastrophe in complicated ways. The Renaissance connection. The Black Death did not single-handedly cause the Renaissance. That claim would be far too simple. The Renaissance had many causes. Classical learning had been preserved and developed across Europe and the Mediterranean. Italian cities were wealthy. Trade networks were expanding. Political competition encouraged cultural patronage. Scholars were studying ancient texts. But the demographic changes created by the plague contributed to the environment in which Renaissance culture developed. Surviving families could inherit wealth. Labor shortages could increase wages. Patrons could finance art. Urban societies could reorganize. The old world had been disrupted. A new one was gradually emerging. Art after the Black Death. Artists responded to the pandemic in many ways. Religious paintings became more emotionally intense. Images of suffering became more prominent. The Virgin Mary, Christ, saints, martyrs, skeletons, and scenes of judgment appeared in countless works. Some artworks emphasized fear. Others emphasized salvation. Still others reflected the fragility of life. The plague also influenced the visual language of death. Skeletons became increasingly recognizable symbols. Graves and decomposing bodies appeared in art. The human body itself became an object of contemplation. Life was temporary. Death could arrive without warning. That message had become impossible to ignore. Literature and memory. The Black Death left a deep mark on European literature. Writers described empty streets, mass graves, abandoned homes, fear, religious confusion, social disorder. But literature also preserved something else. Memory. People wanted future generations to understand what they had experienced. The pandemic became part of family histories. Chronicles recorded deaths. Monasteries kept records. Writers described what they saw. The Black Death therefore survived not only as a demographic event but as a cultural memory. Was the Black Death really black? The name Black Death is somewhat misleading. The term became popular much later than the 14th century pandemic. Medieval writers used different descriptions. Some emphasized mortality. Others described swelling or darkness. The phrase, Black Death, has become the standard modern name, but it does not necessarily reflect what medieval people themselves called the disease. The illness also did not always cause blackened skin. Some severe forms of plague could cause dark discoloration as tissue died, but that was not universal. The historical reality was more complicated than the name suggests. Why did some people survive? This remains an important question. Two people could live in the same household. One might die. The other might survive. Why? Several factors could have mattered. The form of plague. The dose of exposure. The route of infection. Individual health. Age. Nutrition. Genetics. Chance. Modern studies have explored whether genetic differences affected survival and whether exposure to plague influenced later immune systems. The descendants of survivors may carry genetic changes shaped by past epidemics. But scientists continue to debate exactly how these effects should be interpreted. The Black Death was therefore not simply a historical event. Its biological legacy may still exist in human populations today. The bacteria behind the pandemic. Modern microbiology allows us to understand what medieval people could not. Yersinia pestis * is a bacterium. It can circulate among wild rodents and other mammals. Fleas can transmit the bacterium between hosts. When infected fleas feed on humans, bacteria can enter the body. From there, the disease can develop into different forms. Modern medicine has transformed the situation dramatically. Plague is still dangerous. But it is treatable with antibiotics when diagnosed and treated appropriately. Modern surveillance can identify outbreaks. Public health authorities can investigate transmission. Laboratories can identify the pathogen. None of these tools existed in 1348. That difference explains why the same bacterium that once devastated continents can now be treated as a serious but manageable disease when recognized early. The greatest lesson of the Black Death. The Black Death demonstrates the power of interconnected societies. Human civilization is built on movement. People move. Goods move. Animals move. Ideas move. Diseases move. The same roads and ports that bring prosperity can bring disaster. The Black Death was therefore not simply a story about medieval Europe. It is a story about globalization before globalization had a name. The 14th century world was connected enough for a pathogen to move across enormous distances. But it was not scientifically advanced enough to understand what was happening. That combination created catastrophe. A changed Europe. By the end of the main Black Death pandemic, Europe was not the same place. Millions were dead. Some villages had disappeared. Cities had lost enormous portions of their populations. The church had suffered major losses. Governments had lost taxpayers. Landlords had lost workers. Workers had gained bargaining power. Families had been transformed. Wealth had been redistributed. Attitudes toward death had changed. Medicine had been challenged by a disease it could not explain. And political and economic institutions had been forced to adapt. The old world had not completely disappeared. Kings remained. Nobles remained. Churches remained. Peasants remained. But the foundations beneath them had shifted. The long recovery. Europe did not recover overnight. Population growth was slow. In many regions, it took centuries for population levels to return to their pre-plague numbers. But recovery did eventually occur. Agriculture adapted. Cities rebuilt. Trade expanded again. New generations were born. New political movements emerged. New technologies appeared. The printing revolution would come later. The Renaissance would flourish. European states would become increasingly centralized. Exploration would expand. The modern world would gradually take shape. The Black Death was not the end of civilization. It was one of the great turning points in the transition from the medieval world toward early modern Europe. The plague and the modern world. The Black Death remains relevant because pandemics have not disappeared. Modern societies have vastly better medical technology. We have vaccines for many diseases. We have antibiotics. We have laboratories. We have advanced sanitation. We have epidemiology. We have global disease surveillance. But one lesson remains unchanged. A disease does not need to understand political borders. It does not care whether a person is rich or poor. It does not recognize kings, presidents, merchants, soldiers, or peasants. A pathogen follows biology. Human societies must respond collectively. The Black Death showed what happens when a dangerous pathogen meets a highly connected population that has no effective understanding or treatment. The human cost. It can be easy to become numb when discussing enormous numbers. 30 million. 40 million. 50 million. Numbers are useful for historians. But numbers cannot communicate what one death meant to a family. Imagine a mother watching her child become sick. Imagine a husband losing his wife. Imagine a village burying dozens of people. Imagine returning home and finding that everyone inside the house is dead. Imagine walking through a familiar street and seeing doors closed because the families who lived behind them no longer exist. This was the Black Death. It was not simply a statistic. It was millions of individual tragedies happening simultaneously. Every number represented a person. Every person belonged to someone. And every death changed the lives of those who survived. The survivors. Yet there is another side to the story. The survivors continued living. They rebuilt. They married. They had children. They repaired houses. They planted crops. They reopened shops. They returned to markets. They rebuilt churches. They told stories about the dead. They remembered those who had disappeared. And eventually, a new generation grew up that had not personally experienced the first great wave of plague. Life continued. This is one of the most remarkable characteristics of human history. Even after enormous destruction, people rebuild. The Black Death could kill millions. It could reshape economies. It could destroy communities. But it could not stop human societies from adapting. The world after 1352. By the early 1350s, the most devastating phase of the first pandemic wave had passed through much of Europe. But the consequences were only beginning. The demographic crisis continued. Labor shortages persisted. Governments struggled to adapt. Landowners fought to preserve old privileges. Workers demanded more. Religious institutions attempted to rebuild. Communities buried their dead and rebuilt their lives. The plague would return. But the first wave had already changed the world. The Europe of 1352 was fundamentally different from the Europe of 1346. And that difference would influence the following centuries. A turning point in history. Historians often debate whether particular events caused major historical transformations. The Black Death is difficult to categorize. It did not single-handedly create the Renaissance. It did not single-handedly destroy feudalism. It did not single-handedly cause economic modernization. It did not single-handedly weaken the Church. Instead, it acted as an enormous accelerator. It intensified existing trends. It disrupted existing institutions. It created new opportunities. It destroyed old assumptions. It forced societies to adapt. And when societies adapt after a catastrophe, history can move in unexpected directions. The Black Death's final legacy. The Black Death is remembered as one of the deadliest pandemics in human history. But its legacy is larger than death. It changed the European labor market. It influenced the decline of serfdom in parts of Western Europe. It altered patterns of wealth and inheritance. It changed religious culture. It intensified persecution and demonstrated the dangers of scapegoating. It influenced art and literature. It encouraged new approaches to quarantine and public health. It weakened some political institutions while strengthening others. It changed how Europeans thought about death. And it helped create the conditions in which later social and economic transformations could occur. The world that emerged from the plague was not necessarily a better world. For many people, it remained brutal, unequal, and dangerous. But it was different. And history is often changed not by one invention, one king, or one battle, but by enormous disruptions that force ordinary people to reorganize their lives. The Black Death was one of those disruptions. Conclusion: the plague that changed the world. In the spring of the 14th century, Europe still looked like the medieval world that had existed for generations. Castles dominated landscapes. Church bells marked the hours. Peasants worked fields. Merchants crossed seas. Kings fought wars. Children played in villages. Families gathered around fires. Nobody knew that a microscopic organism was moving through the networks connecting their world. Within a few years, millions would be dead. Entire families would disappear. Villages would become empty. Cities would lose enormous portions of their populations. Priests would struggle to bury the dead. Doctors would search desperately for explanations. Governments would attempt to control labor. Workers would discover that their labor had suddenly become extraordinarily valuable. Artists would paint death. Writers would record fear. Religious communities would search for meaning. And survivors would begin rebuilding a society that could never return completely to what it had been. The Black Death did not destroy Europe. It transformed Europe. It exposed the vulnerability of human civilization to the natural world. It demonstrated the extraordinary power of disease. It revealed both the strength and weakness of human institutions. It showed how quickly fear could turn into cruelty. But it also demonstrated human resilience. People survived. They adapted. They rebuilt. They remembered. And eventually, generations that had never seen the Great Plague grew up and inherited a world shaped by it. Today, more than 6 centuries later, the Black Death remains one of history's most powerful reminders that civilization is never as permanent as it appears. Cities can fall silent. Economies can collapse. Institutions can weaken. Families can disappear. But humanity continues. The survivors of the Black Death did not know that they were standing at the beginning of a new era. They were simply trying to live. And in the end, that may be the most important part of their story. The Black Death was a story of unimaginable death. But it was also a story of survival. And the world that came afterward was built by the people who remained.